What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, welcome to the channel. This is my 2001 Lexus GS300 with the 2JZ GE engine. It needs a lot of stuff done to it. It needs all the seals redone, timing belt, I'm gonna do the water pump at the same time, head gasket, and basically all the, like I said, gaskets and seals that go with the job. So let's get this car in the garage and let's get started. For this job, I'm actually going to pull the engine and transmission out of the car. For me, at least, it seems more annoying to have to work in the engine bay. I have the opportunity to borrow an engine hoist and an engine stand. If you guys are watching, the people that allowed me to use these things, thank you very much. Anyway, I have the opportunity to have those tools, so I'm just going to yank the whole engine and transmission out, reseal everything, and then put it back in. This will also allow me to pressure wash everything. Plus, I'm also replacing the power steering rack. That way I can have more room, clean everything, do it right, drop the engine back in, and everything's gonna be fine. The car currently has 171,600 miles on it. So that's not a whole lot, but it is definitely a good time to do a full refresh on it. And these 2JZ engines tend to leak oil. They don't like to keep their gaskets on for too long, so it's that time. Now you can totally do this with the engine and transmission in the car, although it's not ideal, you won't have as much room, but if you have to, then it's totally doable. You just have to, you know, struggle for room a little bit. Make sure that if you are removing your engine and transmission like I am, you have a functioning, well-functioning parking brake, because obviously there's not gonna be park anymore. If I'm pulling the transmission, there's nothing there anymore, so make sure that your e-brake's working well. I actually just adjusted it right before this video. So having said that, I'm gonna put the camera on the tripod, and we're gonna start simple. We're gonna remove the hood, remove the bumper, remove the taillights, and then we're gonna jack it up and start draining fluids. Drain the engine oil, disconnect the power steering pump, drain that. We have to drain the coolant, and then we have to drain the transmission fluid. I also have to reseal the transmission pan anyway, so the fluid's coming out anyway. The main purpose of this video is for me to show you the overall procedure, torque specs, sequences, how I did it, and obviously I'm gonna show everything, but a lot of things I'm gonna speed up, and like I said, I'm not gonna go over every single nut and bolt. The simple things you could probably figure out. Also, any tools and parts that you see in this video are going to be linked down in the description if you'd like to check them out. All right, let's get this car out. All right, now you can see a little bit better what I'm talking about with the leak here. It's basically everywhere. Oil pan, alternator has oil on it, subframe's covered, probably leaking from the front crank seal. I wouldn't be surprised if the rear main's leaking too, so everything needs to be fixed. The fluids don't have to be perfectly drained, just mostly drained, because the engine is going to be disassembled anyway, so it's all coming out. But this is just going to make it easier to remove and less of a mess when you do take things apart. Having said that, that little stream of oil, I'm going to cap it off and call it done. While the coolant is still draining, let's go drain the transmission. All right, on this transmission, the drain plug is a 14 millimeter, just like the oil drain plug, so that's easy. Oh. Apparently that's a very short one, so be careful, I guess. Go ahead and snug this back up. All right, next what I'm gonna do is disconnect the motor mounts while I'm under here. Might as well. So they have this cover in the subframe. Pop that out. And then it's gonna be two 17 millimeters. Just take those out. They shouldn't be super tight. All right, do the same to the other side. I like to put these covers back on just so they can not get lost. All right, so next the exhaust pipe has to come off, and usually there would be a flange right around here, and clearly that has been deleted. I have to patch this area anyway because it's too rusty for me to continue driving like this, so I'm actually just gonna cut the exhaust right here and take the manifold out through the top and drop the rest of this pipe right here. That way I can make room for the transmission and nothing will be in the way, and then I can also fix that issue right there. Okay, so I realized that in order for me to cut that exhaust, I have to move it slightly lower from the engine and subframe, which means I have to unbolt the manifold. To unbolt the manifold, I have to take the intake off so I can get to it. So, well, not the intake, but just the ducting over there. So I decided to come back up top. I'm gonna remove the hood, remove all the front end components, intake, and then I'm gonna go back underneath and continue with removing the exhaust, removing the transmission mount and the drive shaft and so on. Hood has two 12mm bolts on each side and then a 12mm nut right here, which is actually, you need to wrench it. It's on this support piston shock hood strut thing, whatever it's called. It will unscrew from the hood. Now, what I'm gonna do is support the hood with a piece of wood. That way, when I unbolt the hood struts, it's not gonna fall down. There was this tube right here that goes from the radiator fans to the computer ECU box, and I thought it was an electrical connection. Turns out it's just an air duct to cool down the ECU, I guess. Okay, there are three connectors right down here. One for what looks like a temp sensor, coolant temp sensor, and one for each of the two fans. So just unplug those. Alright, now back to the radiator. That's better. You know, I'm not sure, but I might have to buy a new radiator. You tell me. Obviously, I'm joking, I'm gonna buy a new radiator. Now, you might be wondering why I'm taking this whole front end apart. And, well, at first I was hoping to actually move the AC condenser out of the way and then pull the engine straight out. Well, apparently that's not possible because it has a hard line ran right around here. And, well, obviously a hard line won't bend like a rubber line, so that's not possible. So I can't remove this, but at least that eliminates the option of me hitting a headlight or the bumper, scratching it, damaging it, whatever it might be. At least that's not a possibility at this point. So now that we've taken out everything on that side except for the heater core hoses, let's move on to this side and disconnect the electrical. There's one main harness that goes to the engine, so this is super easy. All you have to do is unplug it, whoop, pop it over, and that's most of what you're gonna have to disconnect. So here's the main harness that I was talking about. It has a few clips that you can just unclip. This can stay with the engine. Disconnect all of these connectors. And now just go ahead and disconnect everything. To do this part, a straight pick is probably best, but a pocket screwdriver also works. There are little clips on the side of this panel here that you can pry outward and it should pop free. And that is to get to these two connectors right here. And there we go. Engine harness is disconnected. You can zip tie this or do whatever you want. Just put it over there. I'm gonna reconnect these here and then put the cover back on. Number one, so that I don't lose the cover because I lose everything. And number two, so that it seals it up. And when I pull the engine, maybe something spills or I do whatever. Stuff, debris, liquids, whatever doesn't get in here. While I'm still on this side, I'm going to remove the belt. It's a 14mm tensioner. And I'm also going to unbolt the AC compressor and drain the power steering fluid, and if I have to, I'll unbolt the pump too. To get this power steering pump off, you have to disconnect this upper hose right here, and then the banjo bolt, which is a 17 millimeter, which goes right around the pump. Just make sure you have a collection bucket down there because it's going to make a big mess. And I'm just going to thread the bolt back in. Now with a 14 millimeter, there's a bolt right here, one right here, and another one down there. Alright, so this is the power steering pressure sensor. It's got a connector down there. Disconnect that, then you can remove the pump. And you go ahead and drain it in your collection bucket. Alright, now for the AC, you probably can't see much, but there's basically 4 14 millimeter bolts holding this on. One of them we already took out because of the power steering bracket that goes through it. And then there's one right underneath the tensioner and one right between the AC pulley and the crank pulley. So there is actually a 4th bolt for the AC. It's hidden right underneath this power steering bracket. At this point, this bracket wants to come free, so I'm gonna unbolt it from this, I don't know, hold down right here. There's one more bolt, which is super sneaky. Actually, it's a nut on a stud right back here. Also 14 millimeter. Go ahead and take that out. And another one underneath. How many did they put on here? Just gonna get that one from below. Okay, so I got that one from underneath. And now the AC is ready to come out. So the AC is held on by a total of, I don't even know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 mounting hardwares. Probably the world's most stable AC compressor. Now this can move around, which is perfect. I can't really like take it out or do anything with it, but I need it to be detached from the block so that when the block moves up, I can push this to the side, wiggle it around, and get it out of the way. So that's perfect. Now let's move on to the exhaust side. Time to take the exhaust manifold off, crack all the nuts loose, and then just take them out completely. Alright, next, now that we have the exhaust out, let's undo the alternator. Be careful with this bolt because it's brass. It's a brass stud. Oh! Okay, don't lose that. Unhook this from this little bracket. There you go, and that can stay with the car. One more thing we have to disconnect is, well, this engine ground apparently, and also the heater core hoses. Also have your coolant bucket ready because they're probably gonna spit coolant all over the place. Let's get this ground off. Alright, so it's time to take out the drive shaft. For this, you want to make sure you jack up the rear of the car, put the transmission in neutral, and remove the parking brake if it's applied. Alright, so once you've done all that, you need a 17 millimeter wrench. As you can see, now I can freely spin the drive shaft. And what I'm going to do is remove the bolts that hold the dampener onto the yoke on the transmission. It doesn't matter what you remove, I just want to remove these. Don't ask me why. 17 millimeter bolt, 17 millimeter nut. You can mark your drive shaft if you want to, so that you can put it back in the same exact spot. Now I guess you don't have to drain your transmission. Apparently the yoke doesn't come out of it. I thought it did, so that's my bad, but I'm resealing the pan anyway, so I'm getting drained no matter what. There we go. just push it back, set it aside. There's a ground cable right here that I just noticed. Make sure you disconnect that if you have it. At this point, if you want, you can undo this transmission mount, put a jack under it just to support it temporarily. Okay, so I'm supporting the transmission with the jack right now. I'm just going to undo these 4 14mm mounting bolts for the mount. Now on the other side of the transmission, on the passenger side, the shifter linkage is this bolt right here. It's a 12mm, just undo that and disconnect the rod. Well, mine broke. There we go. That's what was supposed to happen from the beginning. Next, what you want to do is undo the throttle cable. So open the throttle plate and remove the cable from there. Then you have 2 14mm nuts right here that you have to hold with wrenches. Loosen this up and it should pop free. That stays with the car, but it has a little bracket here that it needs to unhook from at the same time. This hose right here also stays with the car, so remove it from wherever. Here, down there, wherever you want. Okay, next, and I think the last thing that we have to do is disconnect the fuel line. And if you can see that banjo bolt right there, it's from underneath, and you're gonna have to get it with a 17mm socket. After you disconnect that, I think the engine should be ready to pull. All right, so here it is. This is the fitting hose, and here's the banjo bolt. Now let's hook up the engine hoist. So I know this ratchet strap situation over there looks a little sketchy. Trust me, it'll work. I have 2 ratchet straps on that rear hook and 1 chain on the front hook. Everything should be disconnected, and if not, we're about to find out. So let's go. Well, there you have it. It's out. There's plenty of room to pull it. I was afraid that I wasn't going to clear the radiator support right here, which is why I was initially going to remove the radiator support and move the condenser aside, but as it turns out I couldn't, and I was afraid that I wasn't going to have enough room, but there was plenty of room. That trans tunnel is huge, and I left the car jacked up on some 3-ton jack stands, but all the way down, so the wheels are barely off the ground, which meant that I had enough room to aim the transmission down at the end, but also enough height to raise the engine hoist up. So that was important. I don't really have any special tips on doing this because it was so easy, but just double check everything, make sure nothing is still connected, and just keep wiggling at it. It'll come out. Alright, so I brought the engine back inside, and now it's time to disconnect the transmission from the engine. To do that, first of all, if you're pulling it out of a GS300, you're going to have an automatic most likely, unless someone had already swapped it, but stock they only came with automatics, so you're going to have to disconnect the torque converter bolts, which you can do from underneath. So let's do that. So to do that, just take this cover off and put a hole in it. That's great. There we go. And here you have some 14mm bolts, and we're going to have to take those out. Alright, as you can see, the flex plate broke loose from the torque converter. Before I move any further, there's a 12mm right here that holds the transmission pan dipstick, so take that one out. And this is now free. Alright, now continuing with the 14mm, we have the starter right here, 2 bolts. Before I disconnect that though, make sure you unplug the signal wire. There we go. Starter. Another 14mm bolt down here. And just like this one, there's one on the other side, same place. Okay, so now on this side of the engine, you could disconnect the transmission lines from their fittings right here. Mine are frozen, and I'm not gonna try further because I don't wanna break them, so I'm just gonna unbolt them from the engine. Actually, I can leave it bolted up to here, but I'm gonna unbolt them all from the engine. That way they can come out with the transmission. This thermostat housing is gonna have to come off anyway, so I'm just gonna remove it. That way I can get to that bolt easier. There we go. Just gonna put these bolts back where they came from. All right, at this point we can remove the rest of the bolts that hold the transmission to the engine, and those are all 17mm. Just go all around and disconnect them all. Don't forget about this breather tube right here, as well as the electrical, before it all gets disconnected. There are 2 more hidden 14mm bolts underneath. Put a little bit of tension on the engine. It's sitting on jack stands right now. The jack stands are on the motor mounts, and I don't want to take it off the jack stands, but I want to have it just supported enough so that when this drops, it doesn't go all over the place. And I have a jack stand underneath the transmission mount, and then a jack stand right here ready to catch it. Yeah. All right, at this point, we want to start taking everything apart. took it off with this whole bracketry and everything. This all can stay together, it's not a big deal. It's just gonna be easier for reinstallation. Just don't forget when you pull it off, the fuel line is bolted onto the block with 2 bolts, so don't forget about that. All right, so next I wanna take off the alternator and water pump over here. That's just gonna be some 10 and 12 millimeters. Alright, so I guess I can't take the water pump off until the timing cover comes off, which is fine. So I guess let's start taking the timing cover off. Although I will take off this pulley while I'm here. .22 millimeter bolt. Strongly suggest an air impact, because these are very tight usually. Once you've gotten this off, put it back in a little bit, and if you don't have a harmonic balancer puller, then go ahead and rent one from your local parts store. So there's 2 holes on this crank pulley. They're 8 by 125. Your kit should come with bolts. If not, then get the appropriate size. And you can make your own puller, but sometimes it's easier to just take a quick trip to the parts store and rent one. Okay, try and make these 2 bolts as equally spaced out as possible. Now what you want to do is get a wrench to hold the crank bolt. So that's a 22. Loosen this as much as you can, just so that the harmonic balancer has space to pull away. But don't loosen it too much, because you need threads to engage on this, and just run this one in until it pops off. That's pretty much loose, so I'm gonna leave it at this. Undo these bolts. Take this off, and off it comes. Make sure that the little key thing, I forget what it's called, it has a name, but make sure that stays onto the crank. And if it does come off with the harmonic balancer, then make sure you either keep it in there, put it aside, or stick it back onto the crank so that you don't lose it. There's a 5 millimeter Allen. Well, all of these top bolts are 5 millimeter Allen, but there's another one hidden in here. There we go. And there's another one over here. And another one. Let's remove the serpentine belt tensioner. And now this cover can come right off. Okay, next let's remove the valve covers. Okay, so I placed the valve covers back on just for a little bit, and I'm gonna use some paper towels, stuff them here, and blow these spark plug holes, because there's a bunch of oil and debris in there, and the oil doesn't bother me so much, but there's so much debris in there, and we have to take the spark plugs out so we can turn the engine over. And yeah, sure, you could do it with the spark plugs in, but it's gonna be a whole lot more difficult, so why not take them out and turn it over that way. But there's so much oil down here, if I spray it with the blowgun, it's just gonna fly all over. So I'm gonna cover it with paper towels and then spray, and hopefully it comes out all right. Okay, time to take the spark plugs out. Well, this is the first one that was actually tight. That's great. This one's tight. Okay, so the first 3 are tight. These 3 were all, I would call them loose. This is from me blowing on the oil, by the way. It's not from inside the cylinder. All right, now these can come back off. And let's put it at top dead center, and then take the timing belt off. All right, so now it's time to put the engine at top dead center. And to put this engine at top dead center, which right now I actually am a little bit past, so we'll have to go around again until it is, but there's a white mark on each camshaft with a dot in the middle. Well, that's not what you want to line it up by. Those are 15 degrees before top dead center. So what you want to line it up by is, I'll show you in this picture, you can see the notches on the backing plate of the timing cover, and then there are little grooves on each camshaft, and those are top dead center. Do not go by the white painted mark with the dot in the middle. Those are 15 degrees before top dead center. Okay, so line them up with the line that is not painted with the backing plate of the timing cover where it has the little notches indented into it. As for the crank, it has a dot and a line, as you can see in this picture. When all these are lined up, that's when you know you're at top dead center. Another way to know, and this may or may not be a little controversial, but you can stick a small extension in here. It's a round tip, so it won't damage the piston. Basically, you stick it in here and you watch it go up and down as you turn the engine. And if you have these lined up, this extension or whatever you put in here should be all the way up. Oh, turn it clockwise. And also use a breaker bar, not a ratchet, because a ratchet can go both ways. And if the engine wants to kick back, it'll just ratchet backwards, and that's not good. Now remember, this extension is going to go up twice within one cycle because it's a 4-cycle engine. It goes up on the compression stroke and then up on the exhaust stroke. Top dead center is up on the compression stroke. Okay, watch your marks because we're getting close. As you can see, now I have the white painted lines lined up, and on the crankshaft there is a dot lined up with a dot, but that's not what we want. We want to line up the lines on all these 3 sprockets with the markings. And there you go. That's lined up at top dead center. From this point on, if you go to remove the crank bolt, only do it with an impact, because if you use any sort of hand tool, it's going to spin the timing belt backwards. And as soon as you put the impact on, just hit it full power because you want it as quick as possible. You want the crank and cam sprockets to not move whatsoever, especially not backwards. At this point though, we shouldn't need to move the timing belt anymore. I cracked this loose and I'm just going to leave it on here, but the timing belt should not need to move anymore. At this point, we can go ahead and disassemble it, and I'm going to start by removing the tensioner. If you are reusing this tensioner, which I suggest replacing, then before you take it out, put a pin in here. You can use a small cotter pin or a drill bit, whatever you have, something that's not going to break, in order to keep this compressed. I have a new tensioner, but you can use this one. If you do not push it in, then you have to put it in a vise and squeeze it and then put a pin in. No matter what you do though, obviously keep the hardware. Let's go ahead and finish removing the water pump. Not entirely sure why oil came out of here, but oh, that's why, because it has a little area where it likes to cool up. I'm going to leave the crank sensor in here for now. I may or may not remove it later. Timing belt tensioner has a little washer right here. Don't forget to grab that and reuse it. Now for the camshafts, you need a 30mm wrench. You can use an adjustable if that's what you have. Obviously that's all I have. I don't really have 30mm wrenches just laying around, so I'm going to use an impact on this. I'm going to use my air impact because it's quick. I don't want to disturb the camshaft much. 17mm socket on the cam sprocket, and hold this tight. Let's remove the exhaust camshaft sprocket. All right, if it moved a little bit, just put it back at top dead center. It did put quite a good amount of force on my wrench, so I wish I held it a little tighter, but lesson learned for this one right here. All right, for this sprocket right here, you need a 14mm Allen socket. Same thing, hold on tight and blast it off. There is a seal here because this is the VVTi cam, so take this off, and obviously your kit is gonna come with a new seal here. Put this aside. There's a 10mm Allen in here that we're gonna remove. Don't touch any of these bolts because that's for the VVTi gear. Before we go ahead and do that though, I'm gonna remove the VVTi solenoid just so everything can be free in here. All right, 10mm Allen socket, blast that off. All right, well, as you saw in that previous clip, I had to put the timing belt back on because this 10mm bolt would not come off whatsoever. My wrench up there kept slipping and it just wasn't working. And before I caused any damage, I wanted to just pause, put the belt back on, immediately the bolt came off. So learn from my mistake, take it off with the belt still on. At this point, you can take these out, keep them in a safe location, and especially keep this in a very clean location because this is the VVTi gear with oil inside. At this point, I'm going to take this VVTi assembly off, and the way to do that is you have a big giant bolt right here. Not sure exactly what size it is, but take that off. The line is connected on this water neck right here, as well as with the same size bolt, big giant bolt down here by the block, 10mm and Allen heads. Take this off first so that we can then unbolt the rest of the camshafts and pop them out. Now at this point you might say, oh no, the camshaft is in danger because it's under pressure. Well, it's not, because this cam isn't actually pressing down on the spring right now, or this lobe of the cam I should say. So it's being held on here, and past this, no pressure. So I removed this first because of that. Alright, now you don't have to do this, but I'm going to go ahead and remove all the exhaust studs from the block just because I want to take everything off so I can clean the surface, and also so that during transportation to the machine shop they don't get hit or anything. I'm also going to take off these brackets, these top studs right here, this bracket, these two, like everything that sticks out to the side. I want to take it off so that one, there's no potential for damage, and two, so I can clean everything. To take these off you'll need an E8 inverted torque socket, and they should come out fairly easy. Now I have new exhaust gaskets, but these are totally reusable. They're multi-layer steel gaskets which compress, and I'm going to save them just in case, but I'm going to use my new ones when I put it all back together. Need an E7 for these two, and an E5 for the valve cover studs. On this side there's this small water neck right here. Okay, on this side we're going to remove the cam position sensor. I'm going to be super gentle with this thing and put it in a very clean and safe location. I'm going to use our 19mm socket and remove this coolant temp sensor, I think it is. There we go. Yep. And a 17mm socket, and remove this, whatever this is right here, a plug of some sort. At this point the head's fully stripped out, so we can start removing the camshafts. Alright, so now we're going to remove the intake camshaft, and I'm going to follow the procedure that you see on the screen right here. So we're starting at this bolt and then following along with the appropriate sequence. I'm going to break them loose first, then I'm going to double check that they're all actually loose, and then I'm going to take them out and put them each cap with each bolt in their own individual baggies, and I'm going to label them. Alright, I'm now going to take the cam caps off, and I'm going to put them in the same exact order on my workbench and lift up the cam. I'm going to put that down right next to it. Now we'll do the same on the exhaust side. I'm going to start by removing this end cap right here, which is actually not part of the sequence. Alright, now it's time to break the head bolts loose. I have my diagram right here. I'm going to put a picture of it on the screen. You're going to go in this sequence. I'm going to turn them 90 degrees first, just crack them free in the whole sequence. Then I'm going to go back around, loosen them all the way, and then I'm going to pull them off. Keep in mind, you're going to need one of these sockets. It's a very long M12, it's a triple square socket. Just keep in mind that you need it to be extra long so that you can get down into the grooves. So here I go back around in the same sequence, another 90 degrees. This time it should be a whole lot easier. Alright, and now you can go ahead and pull them all out. And now with a nice magnet, just pick them all up. Alright, should be 14 of them. And there are washers as well down there, which you're going to have to fish with a magnet. Now these bolts are torque to yield bolts, and I bought new ones, and you should too. Okay. Head is now detached. Pretty heavy, so be careful. Alright, let's take the head gasket off. And this is a non-turbo motor, obviously, so it's got the single steel layer head gasket on it, not the multi-layer steel, unfortunately. This car did have a coolant leak somewhere. It definitely had oil leaks through the head gasket, and it also would not hold vacuum under the coolant vacuum gauge, so I'm pretty sure it had a coolant leak somewhere in here. At this point, this surface can get cleaned up and prepped for a new head gasket. I'm going to remove the lower and the upper oil pans as well, and I'll show that in the video, but for right now, we're just gonna prep the surface up here to accept a new head gasket and the machine head. Meanwhile, this head is getting sent to the machine shop. They're gonna replane it for me, make sure everything is nice and functional as it should be. And then they're also going to replace the valve seals for me, and I probably shouldn't leave this on its side because, well, this happens. So let me flip it over. This thing's actually pretty heavy, and as I was saying, it's going to go to the machine shop and they're going to plane it for me, get new valve seals installed, cleaned as well, and it's going to come back and we're going to put it all together. Now I know we have the head gasket off, but I'm actually going to go ahead and remove the lower oil pan and then the upper oil pan so I can reseal those as well. That way everything is all set. At this point you can go ahead and drain the oil pan again. I did, and that's how much oil I got out of it, so a good amount. I'm going to leave this collection bucket right here and take the oil pan off. Alright, so next I want to remove the upper oil pan, and in order to do that we have to remove this level sensor. I should mention this is the oil level sensor. So in case you didn't know, your car has a little light on the dash which lights up when you are low on oil, and this is what senses it. It has a little floaty thingy here, and when the oil gets low, this goes to the bottom, makes the light go on. There you go. Carefully remove this. And at this point we can remove all of this. So we'll start with the pickup screen. There we go. This has a little gasket here. I would save it and reuse it. There we go. And now we have access to the bolts that hold this part on. Now these are all 12 millimeters, and what I'm going to do is use a long ratchet, break them all loose, and then I'll just run them out with the impact. Actually, these here are going to be 14s. Some small prying areas around here. So you have an area right here where you can pry. As you can see, that allows the front to lift up. Same on the other side. And then right here you can pry as well. That allows the rear to lift up. There we go. All right, so next I'm going to remove the oil pump. Now this is not necessary, and I'm only doing it because I'm just doing a complete full reseal on it, and I want to replace the oil pump seals, but like I said, you don't have to. Now it's just a bunch of 12 millimeter bolts. Again, I'm going to break them loose and then drive them out and then remove the oil pump. You can pry, but be very gentle. And these are the two seals that you want to replace. RTV around this, and the front main seal, or the front crank seal, whatever you want to call it, is this one right here. And this should come in the kit. These may not, so you might have to order them from Toyota or Lexus. Okay, so I have a piece of cardboard here, and that's to protect from any debris going into the engine. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a razor blade, scrape all this old RTV here, and get rid of the rust that might have gotten onto this surface. And we'll do the same to the upper oil pan, and then as well to the lower oil pan, and it's going to be time for reassembly. Alright, so the next step for me is going to be cleaning the head surface on the block. As you can see, I've already done this last piston area right here. I'm going to use a razor blade and gently scrape away the leftover material. And I just went over with a little bit of brake clean on the top of the piston, and just be careful not to brake clean the cylinder bore too much. If you do, just coat it with oil again so that it stays lubricated. And the reason I hit it with brake clean is because, as you can see, there's a lot of gunk and debris that went down in there and is now stuck on the side of the piston, and I want to get rid of that so it doesn't create any sort of scraping grooves on the side of the piston or on the cylinder bore. So I just want to clean everything, use a razor blade, brake clean, and a wire and a little brush if you need to. Just be gentle and make sure you don't scratch the surface. Also, make sure your engine's tilted facing down. That way all the debris falls down on the ground or on a pan or whatever, not into the cylinder or down these holes. Alright, well, you get the idea. So I'll do the same to the upper oil pan, the lower oil pan, the upper oil pan surface on the block. Basically anything that has a gasket on it, scrape it off. I'll do the same to the oil pump. Okay, so next what we want to do is install the oil pans, oil pump, and basically tied together the bottom end again. What I did, and this was a major mistake, so I'm telling you so that you don't make the same mistake if you don't know, you have to put the oil pump on before the lower oil pan goes on. Now, I did it backwards, and that meant I had to take everything back off to put the oil pump on. So don't make the same mistake I did. And what I'm gonna show you next is putting the oil pump on. And then when you see the footage of me putting the oil pans back on, you're gonna see the oil pump's not here. And that's because I filmed this before I realized that this pump has to go back on before the pans. So put the oil pump on first, then the oil pans. But in the video, you're gonna see it backwards. Just didn't wanna reshoot the whole thing. Again, pump first, then pans, and then let's move forward. Now, around the oil pump, the block is upside down, obviously, so you have two seals right here. I bought these from Lexus. I don't know if you can find them aftermarket or not, but I went straight to their website, ordered them, about $3 each, so nothing expensive, but it's a good thing to replace since you're this far. And then the oil pump actually gets RTV all around it right here to seal up the crank, and then it just slides on and bolts on. So make sure you clean up the surface here with a razor blade, a brush, whatever you have. Clean up this surface here, RTV it, squish it on. All right, so do what you gotta do to get RTV on here. Like I said, clean this surface, make sure it's free of oil, and now slide the oil pump right on. It should have some dowel pins to line up with. Now you'll notice it has two bigger or deeper holes that will take the longer bolts, and then you have several smaller bolts which pretty much go all around the rest of it. Okay, I'm gonna snug these and then we'll torque them down. Alright, so these bolts get torqued down to 15 foot-pounds. I'm just gonna go across just to make sure it's seated well. I'm gonna snug them first and then do the final torque. Alright, that's done. Alright, now everything's done. For the front main seal, I already accidentally popped it out as I was trying this pick out. So basically what I did is with a small pick, very gently just put it underneath and it should pop out. Obviously not as easy as it just did because I accidentally already popped it off, but I just used a little bit of force and it should pop right off. And I suggest replacing it because might as well. You can put a little bit of engine oil on it so that it doesn't have to go in dry. And if you want, you can clean out this area with a paper towel or a rag of some sort and take your new seal and gently press it into place. Now you don't want to press it in too far, but you want to make it flush with the outer housing of this oil pump. If you have a socket that's big enough to go over this, then use that. But otherwise, it should slide on with some decent force. Just make sure it's all even. If it's raised in one area, make sure you push it in a little bit. Front main seal installed. All right, so I have everything cleaned up. The upper oil pan, the lower oil pan, the surface where this oil pan meets the block, and I'm gonna use this black, ultra black RTV. It's made specially to resist oil, so that's what I'm gonna use. You can use other types of RTV, but this one's specially made for oil, so I'm using it on the oil pan. So let's put a bead around both of these and get them mounted onto the engine. Now I will be replacing the rear main seal, which sits right here, but I'm just gonna reseal that part when the time comes. I normally don't flatten this out with my finger, but I was a little uneven in several areas, so I wanted to make sure that it's all evenly dispersed and that the areas that didn't have enough got more and the areas that had too much got some taken away. Again, make sure the surface is clean and free of any sort of oil. This has some dowel pins that you can line it up with. There you go. So you got the 14mm bolts which go right here at the back. And the rest of the bolts are 12mm, and they just go pretty much all around. Depending on how long you keep your engine apart, you might want to lubricate these bearings because the oil eventually will drain, and then when you start it up you want it to be sort of lubricated. And I just put some Lucas engine oil additive, just poured it right over all of them. That way everything's lubricated, and I did the same to the cylinder walls. That way the piston rings can have a minimal amount of lubrication right on startup. Okay, so I will torque them, but I'd like to start them in by hand to make sure that they all go in. Then I'll run them down with my impact, and then we'll torque them. So the 12mm bolts get torqued to 15 foot-pounds, the 14mm bolts get torqued to 29. I'm just going to go in a sort of crisscross pattern starting from the center, and I'll work my way out. You can never double check too many times with oil pan bolts, because as you seat it, one of them will loosen up as the other one tightens. So now that this is done, let's get the oil pickup and the baffling in here and whatever, and then we'll get the lower oil pan on. These don't have to be crazy tight, but tight enough to where they're not loose. And I snug these up first so this can seat itself, and then this will adjust depending on how this seats. Here we go. All right, now we'll put some RTV around the lower oil pan, and then we'll reattach that. Okay, lower oil pan goes on. It has 2 studs that you can line it up with, so that's awesome. Okay, these get torqued to 7 foot-pounds, or 80 inch-pounds if you prefer that. Don't forget to put your oil level sensor back in. It goes this way with the float up, and I should have done this before putting the lower oil pan on, but I'm an idiot, so I forgot. It does have its own gasket, so you don't have to worry about RTV or anything. Alright, so our head is back from the machine shop, so it's time to put it back on. As you can see, I painted the block, I made it all nice and pretty. Make sure the surface is clean. What you see here is just staining and discoloration. It's not actually dirty or has any raised areas or anything. It's perfectly clean. It's just stained from being used. And get your new head gasket, and it has this little slit right here that is not square like the other corners, and that's gonna go on this area here that is not square like all the other corners. You can see this loop matches up with this one right here, and then the corner, these 2 corners here, and there's no other way you can put it. So put this on. All right, and then grab your head. kind of heavy. All right, I forgot to mention, make sure the surfaces are both free of oil, debris, and are perfectly clean. All right, so next we have brand new head bolts, brand new washers for the head bolts, and you have to oil them, lubricate them. You can use, I'm gonna use some Lucas because it's thick and gooey and oily. You can use engine oil if you want. You can use assembly lube, or sometimes they will come with a pack of grease. You can use that. They have to be lubricated because you need to remove the friction from the threads as you torque them down. You need 100% pure torque, and you can't have friction messing up that torque number. So you want to oil them, but make sure that the holes inside the head are not filled with water or oil or whatever else, because you could sort of hydrolock this bolt in there, make so much pressure and crack the block. Make sure everything's clean, and then just go ahead and lubricate them. And again, the reason I use Lucas is because it's sticky and it's not going to run right off the bolt after I apply it. It's going to stay on there for quite a while. So that gives me some time to get everything ready, but in the meantime the oil is going to seep through the threads, or into the threads I should say, and coat them all. Now if you remember, when the bolts and washers were taken out, the bolts came out first, and then I had to fish the washers with a magnet, and that's the same way you have to put them in. You have to put in the washer with a magnet, seat it down there, and then put the bolt in, because they won't fit in between these holes. So you have to do them one by one, washers, and then one by one bolts. Now I have this blow nozzle with a very long attachment on it, and I'm gonna blow down into every single hole, make sure there's no water from when I wash the block, no oil or debris or anything. Alright, take your head bolt tool, which is an M12, 12mm triple square socket, and start all the bolts. Make sure the threads are engaged, and then we'll bottom them out, and then we'll start doing some torquing. Alright, so next I'm going to bottom out the bolts, and I'm just going to drive them down close. I'm not going to tighten them, I'm not going to snug them or anything. I'm just going to drive them down close, and then in the sequence, which I'll post on the screen, you're going to be seeing it backwards because the camera's from the other side, but I'll post the sequence on the screen, and just make sure you follow that. Now the torque spec next is going to be 26 foot-pounds in the same sequence that I'm posting on the screen right now, and then in the same sequence we're going to go 90 degrees and another 90 degrees. So start out with 26 foot-pounds, and we'll go from there. Now if you want, you can just go snug and then go to 26, or you can just go straight to 26, whatever you prefer, but just make sure you follow the sequence to avoid any sort of warpage, breakage, or any other mishap. It's worth taking your time here, no matter how long it's going to take. Just take your time. I'm going to go around and check 26 one more time, and then we're going to start doing the degrees. At this point, if you feel that any bolts are not lubricated enough, go ahead, take it out, and lubricate it. Next, what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab a tiny bit of white paint, and I'm going to mark each bolt individually. That will help me know when I've gone 90 degrees, although 90 degrees is pretty self-explanatory. It's a quarter of a turn, but this will ensure that I can visually see that the bolt went 90 degrees. Here we go. If you hear squeaking, crackling, or any sort of noises, stop, re-lubricate the bolt, make sure there's nothing in the hole, start over. At this point, I'm going to double check that all my bolts are 90 degrees. This one can go a teeny bit more. There we go. Here we go again for a second 90-degree pass, and this is when it gets scary. Double check that all the bolts went 90. Perfect. They're all spot on at 90. That's it. Time for the camshaft. Okay, so I know there is assembly loop from the machine shop on everything, but you can never have too much of this stuff because, well, the engine just sits, and on the first startup, by the time the oil gets up here, the camshafts are going to spin, I don't know, a bunch of times. So you want to make sure everything is very, very well lubricated. So I'm going to go ahead and pour a bunch of this Lucas stuff all over, and then we'll install the camshaft. Alright, so the cam number one is going to be the intake cam. Put that into place. Cam number 2 is the exhaust cam. Now when you put your cams on, the pin that holds the cam pulley or cam gear should be just a little bit offset. I'll show a picture on the screen. These two cylinder 1 cam lobes need to be straight up. And then on the intake cam, the pin that holds the cam gear needs to be at 90 degrees facing this side. I'll show a picture. And the cylinder number 5 cam lobes need to be straight up. So line those up as such. Then you're going to take cam cap number 3 on both sides and 7 on both sides. Oil up the threads and start them in. Just 3 and 7 for now. Now the procedure says to just snug these until they're snug with the cylinder head. Alternate back and forth, make sure everything goes down evenly. Oh, and I should mention, make sure your crankshaft is set to top dead center, because this is the moment where the valves are going to go down. And, well, you don't want them to go down on the wrong cylinder. At this point, you can install your camshaft seals, lubricate them with a little bit of oil so that they slide on and don't go on dry. Just push them flush. A lot easier to install now, and also that's what the procedure says, so that's what I'm going to do. You're supposed to RTV these, and I will. I'm just going to set them in place here so that everything is in position. So at this point, I'm just going to bottom all of them out slowly. The cams are already set in, bottom them out, and then I'll apply some RTV to these end caps right here, then we'll torque them all. Tiny bit of RTV, clean the surface, and drop it on here. Do the same for this one. Also lubricate these bolts. Alright, I'm going to show the sequence up on the screen, and the torque for these is going to be 15 foot-pounds. right, so at this point, all the camshaft retainers are torqued. However, this is not the end of the sequence. So what we need to do is line up both of the cams at the 12 o'clock position. So you're gonna have to spin the crankshaft in order to allow the valves to go down. Otherwise your valves will hit the pistons. And if you're turning it by hand, it's not a big deal. It's not gonna do anything. It's just gonna stop turning. So go ahead and turn the crankshaft just a little bit before top dead center. Just about a quarter of a turn before top dead center is where you're gonna be able to spin the both camshafts freely without the valves hitting the pistons. And now put the two camshafts in the 12 o'clock position. And when I say that, I mean the little pins for the cam gears. Put those at the 12 o'clock positions. And then we're gonna do three passes. So we're gonna loosen certain cam caps at the 12 o'clock position and retorque them, then put it at the 4 o'clock position, or a third of the way down, and then loosen certain cam caps again and torque them, and then again at about 7 o'clock for both, and then that's the end of torquing the camshafts. All right, so now every time you do this, you want to loosen the bolts enough to where they can be spun by hand. So basically free them up all the way, and then we'll torque them down again. It doesn't matter what sequence you do it in, just make sure that everything's being done evenly. Now I'm gonna snug them, and then I'll go around and torque them. Again, 15 foot-pounds. Now we're gonna take the wrench, spin the camshaft to about 120 degrees, so to 1/3 of the way through, and then we're gonna loosen up a few other cam caps. Now the goal of doing this is to basically torque the camshaft down with different pressure points all around. So every time you spin it, a different set of lobes pushes down on the valve springs, and therefore you get different pressure on the areas of the camshaft, and I guess it torques it down more evenly. So that's the purpose. It's not useless. All right, one last time. All right, now if you feel like it, go ahead and double check them all, but after this, I'm pretty sure they should all be good to go. Next, you're gonna install the timing belt cover or backing plate, whatever you wanna call it. The torque for these is 71 inch-pounds. Torque it if you want to. Just make them snug. All right, next, the cam gears. So it says the torque for this one is 60 foot-pounds. To torque this, use your 1/2-inch torque wrench, 17mm socket, and then hold the camshaft with the wrench. Do the same to this one. Now I'm not entirely sure what the torque for this little cap is here, but like I said, it's just a cap, so all it has to do is hold this seal in place. So I guess just snug it. All right, now if you are replacing your water pump, which I am, I bought a water pump and timing belt kit, and it comes with this seal right here, so remove the old one if it hasn't fallen out already, and replace it with this brand new one that should come with your kit. If it doesn't stay, you can use a little bit of silicone paste. That'll make it sticky, and it's gonna wanna stay in there. There we go. And take your brand new water pump, line it up, make sure it's clean. Start in a few of the bolts. And snug them down, and then we'll torque them. There's a tube that goes here on the side, right from the water pump to the head. Just go ahead and mount that for now. And then we'll start these two 10mm bolts, which are what hold these tube in place. If the tube doesn't line up, you can loosen up the water pump bolts just a little bit. My kit did not come with a new seal for this, or for either ends of this tube, so I'm reusing my old one. I really don't like doing that, but it is in the open, so if I ever have to replace it again in the future, it's easy enough. Make these snug, don't go crazy tight on them. On this side of the water pump, there's a gasket that needs to be placed here. Mine has a little bevel. I'm gonna face it towards the tube, then the tube goes this way with the bend towards the engine, and then it has a mounting bracket right here, and then the two nuts go right here on the studs. Snug those down. All right, so I bought a new OEM ASIN thermostat. If you don't want to replace yours, don't do it. But it's right here, you're taking it out anyway. Now it has this little valve here. You want to face that towards the top so the air can bleed out. And this housing faces down, thermostat valve up. You don't have to go crazy tight with this, just snug it and give it a little bit. The water pump gets torqued to 15 foot-pounds. At this point, you want to line up your camshafts, and you don't want to line up the painted dot. You want to line up the line. That's top dead center. Now, when you're lining up the VVTi intake gear, you want to make sure that you spin it clockwise and you have it positioned that way, not counterclockwise and position it that way. So in my case, I need to keep going a little bit. Again, don't line it up with the dot, line it up with the little line. And there we go. The dot is going to line up with the edge of the timing cover here where it's cut out. And there we go. Now the cams are lined up. Let's line up the crankshaft. And on this, you can probably remember there's a dot right here on the oil pump, and then there's a line on the crank gear. So just spin that until they line up. And that's it. Now my kit came with a brand new pulley for the tensioner and the tensioner itself. You don't necessarily have to buy them, but it just is one less thing you have to worry about that it might go bad before the next timing belts do. So you might as well just buy it. I'm gonna insert my tensioner in here, line up my belt. Okay, this is taut right here. So is this. Time for the tensioner. Don't forget that on your tensioner pulley, there's a washer that needs to go on, which spaces it out from the block exactly how much it needs to be spaced out. All right, I'm gonna double check that my marks are still lined up. These two are, this one's lined up. At this point, what I'm gonna do is torque these down. Now the torque on this is 25 foot-pounds. And on these two bolts, it's gonna be 18 foot-pounds. All right, I'm gonna pull the pin, which I guess it was already loose. And now I'm gonna spin the engine over a few times and make sure that after I make several complete tours, the timing marks are still lined up properly. Here we go. There's our first problem right here, this pin. I didn't line it up properly with the timing belt. There we go. Make sure you line up that pin. Make sure that the timing belt does not fall off. All right, well, if you can do this, then your engine is not going to blow up when you start it. So now make sure you're at top dead center again. I just want to leave it that way. So these two are still exactly where they need to be, and that one is exactly where it needs to be. So that's it. Timing belt's on. Right down here, you have this little tiny plate that basically holds the timing belt on the crankshaft. If it was ever to skip a tooth, it doesn't allow it to. Well, one thing I realized is that the crankshaft position sensor doesn't fit with the tensioner on, so I had to take that back off again. Now the crankshaft position sensor fits. Just snug it down. That's installed. Now this goes on. Don't make the same mistake I did. All right, so next what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put this variable valve timing oil feed tube back. It has banjo bolts on both ends with some washers, and if those fall off, then make sure you put them back, because obviously they help seal up everything. Probably would be great to replace them, but I don't have new ones, so I'm gonna put the old ones on and hope it doesn't leak. And if it does, then I'll see about sourcing some new ones. Oh, don't forget, in here, there's a little filter that goes in there. This is what it looks like, and it goes with the pointy part inward, just like that. Grab your 22mm tool and snug these up. I'm sure they have a torque, but I don't know it, so I'm just gonna go with tight as tight, and obviously don't over tighten them, don't go crazy. Next is this variable valve timing solenoid. It has an O-ring at the bottom, and you can lubricate that with a little bit of oil so it doesn't go in dry. There we go, and it has a bolt on top. Snug that up. All right, so this part's done. Next, what I'd like to do is get the valve covers on. All right, now for the valve covers, remove your old gasket, clean them, and install the new gasket. Make sure everything's seated properly. I also went ahead and painted them, because why not? And if you removed any studs from the block, or from the head I mean, which I did, I removed every single stud from this head before it got sent to the machine shop. Now is the time to put them back on. The valve covers do have 4 studs, which help you locate the valve cover as you're placing it down. And you do need to use a little bit of RTV right on the corners here where it meets the last, or first, I guess, camshaft retainer. So I'm just gonna squeeze a little bit of RTV right on here. As always, make sure it's clean and dry. So here's number 1. And number 2, make sure the gasket is in properly. So the gasket came off, but it actually went right into its groove as I placed it, so that's good. All right, let's get the bolts and snug them down. I'm just gonna snug them down first, and then we'll torque them to 75 inch-pounds. Next I want to put in the ignition coils, or sorry, the spark plugs first, then the ignition coils and the wires. These get torqued to 13 foot-pounds, so between 13 and 15 is okay. Now at this point, go ahead and put your spark plug wires back on, as well as the ignition coils. So cylinder number 1 is going to have a wire, and the coil is going to sit on number 6. Cylinder number 2 is going to have an ignition coil, and the wire is going to go over to 5. Cylinder number 3 is going to have a wire with the ignition coil on 4. This ignition coil is going to sit on number 2, feed cylinder number 5. Now, the wires should have some retainers, but mine broke, so coil pack number 6 will feed cylinder 1. Coil pack 4 will feed cylinder 3. Alright, at this point, if you want to put your wiring harness back on, go ahead. These ignition coil connectors, they always break My Camry has the same ones, and luckily I had extra connectors because I had to replace 2 of them. I don't know if I mentioned this when I took them out, but they broke. What usually breaks on them is the inside right there. The white piece just crumbles. So I had a few extra ones from the junkyard. You can also buy them online. You can find them on Amazon, probably eBay. If you want to call Toyota and ask for them, I'm sure they'll have them, but you're gonna have to wait because I tried to call them once and get OEM connectors, and they were like, yeah, you have to wait a couple weeks for them to be shipped in. So that didn't happen. But anyway, you can get new ones, but if you want to just buy some aftermarket ones, you can easily find them on Amazon, like I said. So the wiring harness went kind of like this. This was connected on the intake here, on the underneath of it, and then this came around like this, and this big connector right here goes to the computer, which is right over there. All right, now connect your ignition coils in. You can't mess this up because you have 3 different length wires, and obviously those go to their specific location. All right, here's our brand new lower intake gasket. Just go ahead and line it up with these studs. Make sure it lines up with the ports. Obviously make sure the surface is clean. All the bolt holes line up, so that's perfect. Grab your lower intake manifold and place that on the studs. Oh, there's a bolt down here that holds this bracket in place, and I have it threaded into the block, so I'm going to take that out before. Now I'm going to put the intake on. There we go. There are also 2 other bolts here that hold the fuel line in place. Forgot to take those off, so I'm going to take them off before I bolt it down so that I don't have to bend the fuel line out of my way. I'm just going to start on the nuts that go on these studs so I can let go of the intake. Alright, so on top of the 2 nuts that go on the studs, you have 2 long bolts, 5 short ones. Pretty easy to figure out where those go. The long bolts go up top here because it's got a long hole until it reaches the threads. And all the other bolts, the short ones, go on either sides and on the bottom. And I'm just going to start all these in, then we'll torque them and everything. I remember this device here had to come off for this. Once you take this off, you have access to this bolt. Work to 20 foot-pounds. I'm going to start from the center and then work my way towards the outside. Alright, it's important to go back and forth because they'll loosen up as the gasket sets into place. Before I forget, there's this little water neck thingy that sits right in here. And I'm going to put a new gasket on it. There's a bolt on the bottom, and then 2 studs with nuts. Should have done this way earlier. Not exactly sure what the torque for this is, but I'm just gonna go with tight. This little bolt right here holds the bracket for the oil feed for the VVTi solenoid. Snug that down. This wiring harness went down here through the middle, and it used these 2 studs to fasten itself. Now let's plug in our connections up here. Got the VVT solenoid, and then injectors. Injectors have gray and brown connectors, and it goes gray, brown, gray, brown, gray, brown. And then the cam sensor. My clip is broken on this one, so I'm just gonna zip tie it. If you disconnected this little device here, then make sure you put it back on, and it does have a wire going to it, so connect that. Alright, next, before I forget, I'm actually going to move down here, reconnect these 2 bolts for the fuel line. Don't forget to put this bolt on for the lower part of the intake. This had a ground point right here, so I'm just gonna clean this up a little bit and then put a bolt through. There are two connectors right here. The gray one goes to this knock sensor over here. And then the knock sensor on this side has its harness right here. The coolant temp sensor is right underneath the intake here. Down here is the oil pressure, oil level sensor. And I'm pretty sure this ground shared a mounting bolt with this little hold down right here. There we go. This coolant hose, I'm pretty sure goes up to the intake, so we'll route that this way. The throttle body, I mean. Quickly double check that everything is the way it's supposed to be. Oh, you got oil pressure sensor right here. Don't forget about your dipstick tube. Dipstick tube goes right on here. All right, now what I'm gonna do is take all these bolts off and I'm gonna put them in the upper intake in the holes that they're supposed to go in. That'll make it easier, and it'll basically line them up as I put the intake on. All right, line up your gasket now. Make sure it matches, if not, you have it backwards. All right, for this one I'm just gonna go with make it very snug. The torque spec is somewhere in the mid to low 20 foot-pound area. And you have one connector that goes in right there. And then you have a vacuum hose here. And on this side there's a couple things that need to be connected. That and a vacuum hose right here. And then a vacuum hose right there. And then there's a vacuum hose that goes in here, but that comes on after. All right, next I want to put on the throttle body and all these hoses right here. So my kit came with a new adapter plate gasket thing, whatever this is. And there's a stud on the old one that if you put a pair of vice grips on, you can just remove it. If you can't remove it, then I guess just reuse this, but my kit came with a brand new one, so I'm just gonna put a brand new one on. Now this stud went on the bottom of the threaded area, and this gasket unit thing goes like this, so it's gonna be this bolt right here, or this threaded area. Make sure the surface is clean. Plate gets bolted on with the 12mm bolts. I don't know the exact torque specs for this, but just make it snug. And then you got this stud, and then these two long bolts here. Throttle body goes on. And then there's this coolant hose right here that I routed through the lower intake earlier. That has to slide right on. And then just install the mounting hardware. All right, just make them all snug. And then go ahead and connect your electrical connections. Next, I'm gonna get some needle nose pliers and start putting all the hose clamps back before I forget. Now on this side, you have two hoses to connect. One is the PCV for this side valve cover, and that connects to right here. And then you have this heater hose, which goes to the heater core, and it comes off the back of the head. One more thing before we go back to the front of the engine. There's this bracket here that supports the throttle body. This is supposed to have a bolt fastener thing here, but it's broken, so. And on the back side of the intake, or the throttle body, don't forget this coolant hose. All right, now back at the front of the engine, the serpentine belt tensioner needs to go on next before you put the timing covers on. Otherwise you won't be able to tighten this on. I know this probably has a torque, but I'm going with tight. All right, next make sure everything's clean here. It's time to put this timing belt retainer on here, and then the lower timing cover can go on. Now this lower timing cover had 10mm bolts, and the upper timing cover is the one that had the Allen heads. Now, I don't know exactly what happened. I believe that the timing cover swelled up from oil, therefore the harmonic balancer made contact with it. I don't have a new timing cover, so hopefully this one doesn't scrape. If it does, then, well, I'll figure something out, but either way, that's where all these marks came from. And now it's time to put on the harmonic balancer. I painted it, cleaned it up and painted it. All right, and now the crank bolt, and this gets torqued to, yep, torqued. And of course I had to match my water pump pulley to the freshly painted crank. And I got a new idler pulley as well, or tensioner pulley. All right, and now the upper timing cover goes on. This one had Allen head bolts, one on each side and one in the middle. To finish all of this off, put on this top cover right here, which I don't really like, but I'm gonna use it anyway. All right, next I'm gonna get the alternator mounted. And down here it has a stud. Well, it's supposed to be a stud. Mine came off with the nut. And then up here, it mounts on the water pump. The stud is an E8. If you need to thread it in more, it's inverted Torx. Both the nut and the bolt are 14s. All right, alternator is mounted. All right, so the engine is off the engine stand. I got it onto the engine hoist. Transmission's ready, and the last thing we have to do before we put the transmission on is to replace the rear main seal. To do that, you're gonna have to remove all 8 of these 14mm bolts that hold on the flex plate. Okay, so remember it had this, well, okay, so remember it had 2 of those spacer washer things, and it's gonna have the area that does not have welds on it, that's gonna face towards the engine. The area with the welds is gonna face towards the outside, or towards the transmission. I'm now going to clean everything up before I take this seal off, because I don't wanna clean with chemicals with the new seal installed. All right, that's better. Now remove the 10mm bolts that hold on this whole plate right here. There are 2 little areas on each side that you can use to pry. This unit here has 2 dowel pins that it lines up on, so it might get stuck on these a little bit. Now, next you want to clean this whole surface here, and the best way to do it in order to not get anything inside the oil pan is probably to have a shop vac or a vacuum cleaner right next to where you clean. That's how I'm going to do it. If you have any other ideas, if you want to cover this area, go ahead. But for me, I think that's going to be the easiest way to do it, is just have a vacuum cleaner, and any RTV that I scrape off is just going to go into the shop vac. All right, and after you've cleaned this area and this area as much as possible, we can pop out the seal. So for this seal, if you have super strong fingers, you can pop it out the back. If not, you can use a rubber mallet, a little pry bar, whatever you need to do to get this seal out of here. Then we can slightly clean this surface right here and install our new seal. So my kit came with the rear main seal and this gasket that's supposed to go right here. I don't know if I want to use this gasket because from the factory it was RTV'd, and clearly the surface was designed to be RTV'd from the factory. And sure, this might last, but is it gonna last as long as the factory designed RTV? I don't know. So what I'm gonna do is not use this gasket, and I'm gonna go for the RTV because, like I said, it was RTV'd from the factory. So I'm gonna go very thin coat all along this surface and then right down here on the oil pan. you have it. It pretty much ran out of RTV, so perfect. I'm just gonna make sure this is equally spread out. There we go. I might have gone a little too thick on here. That's all right. Now take your freshly degreased and cleaned plate. I'm gonna go up high a little bit and then drop it right down on the RTV of the oil pan and then line it up with the dowel pins. You can give it a couple bonks to seat it. Start your bolts in. Obviously, if you don't want to reseal this plate here, then don't, but I don't know why you would not want to do that. Not sure what the torque spec for this is, so I'm just gonna go for make it snug. They're very small bolts, so you don't have to go crazy on it. And when it comes time to install the seal, obviously make sure everything's clean, and then you can use a little bit of engine oil or some silicone paste and just lubricate the outside of it. That way it doesn't go in dry. It'll have an easier time sliding in. And line it up. Just go easy and even pressure, and it should slide right on. Help it along with a rubber mallet if you need to, and just make it flush with this housing here. You don't need to drive it in too deep. If you don't have a rubber mallet, you can use the back of a screwdriver or something that's soft, definitely not a metal hammer. All right, there we go, that's done. Now the next step is to clean all the thread locker off of these bolts and then reapply new thread locker before you put them in here. All right, so at this point, we're ready to reinstall the flex plate. Put this spacer washer thingy in, and it has a beveled edge, and it does not obviously go this way because that's gonna rub against the seal. Make sure the bevel is outward. Match up the bolt holes, the side with the welds towards the transmission, and match that up. And then finally we have this plate right here, which will go just like this. And then I've already cleaned up my bolts like I said I would and applied red thread locker. Don't be afraid to use too much on these because these bolts experience a lot of vibrations, and we'll definitely be torquing these. So start all of these in. I'm gonna just bottom them out and then we'll pull out the torque wrench. So these bolts get torqued to 61 foot-pounds, and you can do this several ways. You can either have someone hold the crank, or you can put a breaker bar on there and wedge it up against something, or you can just use the holes on this flex plate. I'm gonna choose to use this one down here. That's gonna prevent it from spinning as I torque this down. Make sure you go in a cross pattern so you can seat this properly and evenly. All right, so now that they're all torqued, I'm just gonna go around one more time and make sure that they're all at 61 foot-pounds. .61 foot-pounds on all of them. Now let's put the transmission on. So on this side right here, you can't see it, but that's where the starter is. And I'm gonna go ahead and connect that because the starter is actually bolted through the transmission bell housing. So that's part of those are part of the fasteners for the transmission. All right, so one last thing that's left to do is to put in the torque converter bolts. I cleaned them up so there's no oil on them, and then I put some Loctite on them. I'm just gonna thread them in here. Not quite sure what the torque for these is. They have Loctite, so I'm just gonna impact them on. And then use your breaker bar, spin the engine clockwise, and put in all 6 of them. And lastly, this cover. I wish I had a new one, but I don't, so I'm just gonna use this one. There we go. Mine's a little bit broken. All right, at this point, the engine and transmission can go back in. And it's finally time to put the drivetrain back in. Don't forget to connect the transmission connectors to the transmission. It's easier to do while the engine's out. It was actually a little bit more difficult to put it in than it was to take it out. However, I still managed to get it in there quite easily. Ignore the pool floaties and balloons in the car. That's a story for another day. But anyway, the motor mounts are actually quite difficult to line up because the orange strap that I had on the rear hook was actually making contact with the cowl, and I didn't want to take the cowl out because it was like so close, maybe half an inch away from the motor mounts dropping into place. And believe it or not, that half-inch distance was actually pretty hard to pry into place. So it took me a good 15, maybe 20 minutes of moving around. I had the transmission jacked up from the transmission mount, and I was trying to maneuver it so that the motor mounts would slide backwards while the top of the engine was like hitting the firewall and the cowl. It was kind of a nightmare, but I figured it out in the end. So at this point, you want to make sure you connect the grounds on the passenger side of the engine that you disconnected, as well as any connectors that you want to connect at this point. I'm also going to go ahead and connect the throttle cable just so I don't forget about it, and a couple other vacuum hoses that are around there that need to connect to the car. And at this point, it would be a good idea to connect the main harness to the ECU. That way everything is in place and all the main and all the important connections are all set. So for the AC, there's a stud down below, a long bolt right back there, and then this bracket goes on just like this. So the AC also has a bolt here and then a bolt underneath, don't forget about those. And then this little bracket goes like this, curves down. There's a two-prong connector here that goes on the pressure side of the power steering pump. This hose connects to the return hose or line, and then this bolt right here is the high pressure outlet, and has these two gaskets here that got a little crushed, so hopefully they don't leak. If they do, I'm going to have to source new ones. Make sure the surfaces are clean, and this is a 17mm. Alright, it's time to put the radiator in. I bought a brand new one. If yours is not in good shape, then you probably should. Mine was unexpectedly in very poor shape. Don't forget there's this little tube here that cools down the computer right from the fans. Alright, next up, since I'm in this area, I'm going to put the air intake and filter housing back on. I put a new air filter in it, and I cleaned up the housing on the outside a little bit just because it was covered in oil somehow. All set. I'm gonna put the belt on. I could have done this before, and well, I forgot, so I did not buy a new belt. I wish I did. I do have a new serpentine belt tensioner, but I did not buy a new belt because it looked in decent condition, so I'm gonna reuse mine. If you don't know, the belt routing diagram is right on the strut tower over there. All right, I'm gonna go underneath now and connect the fuel line and the starter, which I'm not gonna show on camera because I can barely see what I'm doing down there when it comes to these two things, so I'm gonna skip showing that, but I'm sure you can figure it out if you've gotten this far in the process. So I'll pick up right after. We'll put the drive shaft on, connect everything else underneath. I believe there's a ground cable that we still need to connect, and probably some other miscellaneous things. Oh, the shifter, and then we'll fill her up with fluids and try our first start. All right, so I connected the shifter linkage again. I put a bunch of anti-seize all over it. I didn't show it because I was just focused on doing it, but it's pretty simple. In case your stud didn't break, which mine did, and I just welded another stud onto it to extend the threads, but if your stud doesn't break, then all you have to do is slide this rod over it. It goes up and back to the shifter, so it does not come from underneath, it comes from up above, and it's slotted, so you just put it on, it only fits one way, and you tighten up the nut. I'm thinking the washer goes on the nut side because the nut is smaller than the bolt. That way it has a bigger surface area to clamp on. Alright, at this point I'm going to go ahead and put fluids in it. I'm going to fill up the transmission, put engine oil in it, change the filter, fill it up with coolant. So I filled the oil, filled the transmission, filled the power steering, filled the coolant. I attached the lower radiator hose right there, and then the transmission cooler lines. Everything should be ready to go. The only thing I realized is that this car is probably not going to want to run right without O2 sensors, so I have to put the manifold in. The reason I'm not putting the exhaust on is because I have to work on it. As you can see, that used to be a flange and is no more. So I need to basically cut it right here, put my own flanges on so I can connect it to the rest of the pipe. But I want to start it up before I do that to make sure everything's all set. So I'm going to go ahead and put the manifold on, get the O2 sensors connected, which is not a big deal, so I'm not going to show that. There's one connector right here, one connector here, one on the back, and then one goes under the passenger side carpet. That's it. I'm just going to put the manifold on temporarily, and then we'll start it up. One thing I want to mention before you start it up is I recommend pulling the EFI fuse, the electronic fuel injection fuse. That will make the injectors and the fuel system not run. That way you can prime the engine with oil before you go ahead and start it. Then I'm going to put the relay back in. You can also pull the fuse. It's got a fuse right there, and then the relay's right there. It's easier to pull the relay than it is the fuse, so that's what I pulled. But basically you want to pull that, crank it for like, I don't know, 10-15 seconds or more if you want, just to get the oil circulating a little bit through the engine. Then I'm going to put that fuse in, prime the fuel, then I'm going to start it. Alright, manifold's on, intake is on, battery is connected, nothing wrong so far, so that's good, I guess. So let's go ahead and crank it and get some oil pressure circulating, and then we'll plug the fuel in and prime it. Okay, we got a bad connection somewhere. Let's figure that out. So I disconnected the starter and cleaned up the connection and reconnected it, and I think that was it. Oh yeah, let's crank it over. Alright, that should build up a little bit of oil pressure. Go ahead and put your relay in and put that cover on. I'll prime the fuel system a few times, even though I think it already did it. Make sure you keep filling your power steering fluid. As you could tell from the video, the whine of the power steering pump was definitely loud, and that's even though I tried to bleed it manually as much as possible, it still was empty. It sucked down all the fluid, so keep an eye on that. It did take less than a quart in total, so the whole system is very small, but just make sure you keep it topped off. Now at this point, what I'm going to do is start getting the front end back together. I'm I'm not going to show you putting the hood on and putting it on the ground. You're going to need to sit there and watch me struggle to put the hood on by myself, which if you didn't take it off, it's very heavy. All right, so just to end the video, it's been 3 months, pretty much exactly. I finished this car on August 9th. It's now November 6th, so pretty much 3 months. As you can see, has 176,700 miles, which is exactly 5,100 miles after I finished the engine rebuild. So I just wanted to make this video saying that everything's okay, everything's perfect. There are no leaks, there are no problems. The engine runs fine. I've done redline pulls with it, burnouts, and everything is just fine. Unfortunately, it's already in winter mode with the winter tires on it, but I did tint the windows since the last time you saw the car, so that's pretty cool. So having said all that, if you have any questions or concerns about things I did not go over, make sure you leave them in the comment section below. I'll try my best to answer them. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Ring that little bell so it can tell you when I post new videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay tuned.